This is, in a sense, our emotion brain, our emotion mind, and our wise adult. And when it's active, it's really hard to think rationally. Hi, this is Jim Breon. Welcome to this YouTube channel where we discuss all things mental health. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and licensed professional clinical counselor in Orange County, California. What I'm going to be talking about today is, I think, what's going to become the beginning of a small series on trauma. Specifically today, I'm going to be talking about how trauma affects the brain. When people live through a traumatic experience, really what trauma is, it's a subjective thing. So what's traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for another person, based on lots of individual differences. But essentially, a person experiences trauma when an experience that they go through overwhelms their ability to cope with it in the moment. And there are different types of trauma. I think when most people think about the word trauma, they think of what we generally consider to be shock trauma or maybe capital T trauma. That's events that happen in war situations, maybe kidnappings, a sexual assault, a physical assault. There's also something we think of as small t trauma or developmental trauma or complex trauma, meaning that it's not just one major event that creates the trauma and possibly even post-traumatic stress disorder, but smaller repeated episodes of traumatic experiences. This can be growing up in a home with emotionally immature parents, or alcoholic or drug-addicted parents, or narcissistic parents. It can mean growing up in a situation where you're chronically shamed and invalidated, bullying that happens repeatedly. So it's good to know that there are different types of trauma. What happens in a person's brain when they experience traumatic events involves very serious changes that can be seen in a person's brain in several specific areas of the brain. Now, first of all, if you were to use this as a model for the brain, say that this is our brain, this is our spinal cord, and the old part of the brain, the reptile brain, that keeps your heart pumping and keeps your perspiration happening, keeps your lungs pumping oxygen. We have a newer part of our brain. We call this the neocortex and the prefrontal cortex. This is where our executive functions happen. It's where we can do problem solving and create language and, plan things and be rational and logical. And we also have an emotional center in our brain. This is where our fight, flight, freeze, appease mechanism gets triggered. It's also where social interactions, feelings associated with them take place. This is, in a sense, our emotion brain, our emotion mind, and our wise adult. When people live through traumatic experiences, the prefrontal cortex, this part where we can do our rational thinking and also helps us regulate our emotions, like fear responses that come from the amygdala in the emotion brain, that part is dysregulated. And with somebody who has PTSD, the prefrontal cortex has actually been shown to have reduced volume in gray matter. What that means is basically the prefrontal cortex can actually start to shrink. Another important effect that trauma can have on the brain happens in the emotion center of the brain. There are two specific areas of the brain that are involved in memory consolidation and survival instinct, and that's we call the hippocampus and the amygdala. The hippocampus is a small feature in the brain that is responsible for memory, differentiating between the past and the present, and it works to help us remember and make sense of things. It helps to consolidate and file away memories. When somebody has especially consistent trauma exposure, again, the hippocampus literally starts to shrink. And then closely related to and connected to the function of memory consolidation and emotion regulation is something called the amygdala, which is a part of the brain that it's wired for survival and the triggering of the fight, flight, freeze response. It's our fear center in a sense. And when it's active, it's really hard to think rationally. In other words, when your emotion mind is driving the bus, so to speak, your reasoning mind is really kind of offline. And there has to be a clear connection between the prefrontal cortex, our rational mind, and our emotion mind. And the more hyperactive this part of the brain grows, the more symptoms of PTSD we start to see in a person. In effect, what starts to happen is the threat perception system starts to become overactive. In other words, the nervous system is constantly on alert. People experience something called hypervigilance, meaning that they're constantly scanning the environment for something that's going to happen. And our filtering system that helps the brain to understand what's important and what's not important is dramatically affected. This is when trauma can actually start to look like symptoms of ADD or ADHD. When we think about how these very serious effects or impacts that trauma can have on the brain, how does that turn into experiences that affect a person's life? In many ways, people can start to participate in what we think of as reenactments. Consciously or unconsciously, they may actually repeat certain aspects of the trauma that they experienced. There's something called a repetition compulsion, where people who've been traumatized will get themselves into relationships that mirror very closely dysfunctional relationships in their childhood and try to get it right this time. People really struggle with the loss of their sense of worth. And emotions and behaviors can sometimes shift and swing between shame and grandiosity, which are two versions of contempt. Contempt for another or contempt for yourself. People often struggle with the loss of a sense of themselves. We discover our identity through mirroring. In other words, having other people show us aspects of ourselves we may not be aware of. And if a parent is also an abuser, that sense of self is never really strongly developed. And it can leave us with a feeling that we're fake, that we're phony, that our sense of self isn't really solidified. In fact, we don't really know who we are. And this is a very common occurrence for people that have suffered trauma, especially early trauma. You can lose a physical connection to the body. In other words, people experience different types of dissociation where you're kind of cut off from your own experience, and people live very much in their head and become detached from the physical sensations in their body and their emotions, because if your body has been violated through traumatic experiences, it's not safe to live in your body. And then dissociation is the disconnection of consciousness from what's happening. And unfortunately, this can turn into a coping strategy whenever the survivor is feeling overwhelmed. A common lingering effect of trauma on people is experiencing shame, internalized shame, toxic shame. And that's a huge part of the recovery process, is learning to overcome that and hand the shame back to perpetrators instead of carrying it yourself. They can often experience a loss or a struggle with intimacy, either learning to avoid intimacy because it's not safe, or entering into intimacy in order to gain approval, or because we've learned earlier that it's a good way to get attention that we crave. People can either walk away from intimacy altogether, or can become promiscuous and not have healthy boundaries around intimacy. Other senses of loss can be the loss of trust, the ability to trust others and to trust yourself. The loss of danger cues. In other words, because the brain is so dysregulated, you can see danger when it doesn't actually exist, and you can be blinded to danger as well. And finally, a loss of the felt sense of safety in the body. These are some of the ways that trauma can affect the brain and the body. And recovery from trauma can often be a very long and difficult process. and it is possible. If the videos are helpful, I encourage you to like and subscribe, sign up for notifications, and leave comments and let me know what you think of some of the videos. Maybe start a conversation with other people. And until the next time, take care of yourself and take care of each other.